So, without further ado, I'm really happy to introduce Professor Camille Gasquin-Reyes. She's an adjunct professor in the Center for Latin American Studies in the School of Foreign Service. She joined Georgetown's faculty in 2009. She's a specialist in Latin American and development studies with over 28 years of policy development and practice, natural resource management, environmental planning and economics, project management, monitoring and evaluation experience in Latin America and the Caribbean. She has a formal career in development banking for 25 years and is currently an international consultant, which is an understatement because she is consulted all over town, and yet she is one of the most enthusiastic faculty members who has supported this course development. She really cares about students, her students, and students everywhere. And so I was happy to invite her again. This is her second appearance before our annual Area Studies conferences. And she is, while her Latin American course consultation is not quite ready, it will be quite soon, and maybe we'll talk about that later. So thank you, Professor Reyes.
Well, thank you, Susan, for those very nice words. I'm very happy to be here. I came to teaching a little bit later in my life and my career. I was a development banker and did a lot of development projects, but I always wanted to be an educator for some reason. And even in my work in the banking area and development, I always managed to train people. It was the best day of my life when I could do this. So maybe I found my calling at this age, but it's such a joy to be here, and I'm so happy. So let's start. Before I start, I just wanted to say I'm very completely happy about what I heard this morning, what you've done, the depth and the content of the different areas you presented are really interested me, and I congratulate you on all of that. There's one book I want to mention for those who are interested in the colonialism, imperialism, Africa nexus, and that's How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. Oh. And if you know it, written by Professor Walter Rodney. He's dead now. And he's a historian. He graduated from Oxford University, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. I use it in my background reading for my George Washington University class on globalization, because we start off by looking at the globalized world and the differences, the haves and the have-nots, and where did it come from. So I just want to say that that's a very good beginning. Anyway, let's go back to cities and people in cities.
Could you just repeat the author's
name? Walter Rodney, R-O-D-N-E-Y. And it's a thesis. It was his PhD thesis published some time ago, but still valid. It's something I always, and I actually had the opportunity to meet him. He was one of my professors actually when I was in college, and he happened to be from the same country. I didn't even know this, but I've always, and he was murdered. He was actually murdered yes, because of his stance against certain things. And he was killed. So very, very wonderful researcher and very smart person. I'm so sorry that he didn't, make it. Anyway, let's go. Sorry. So what I'm going to talk about, and I want to apologize ahead of time for putting too many things in this presentation. I kind of get carried away, and I wanted to share so many things. I asked Susan, I wanted to do like 3 things, but I boiled them to 1 because I feel that whatever we have, we should be giving. We should be sharing. This knowledge economy and the knowledge and information sharing is important. And anything that I know, I don't want to keep it in my head. I want to deliver it. So I'm going to talk about explosive urban growth. Just skim the surface. Developers versus development in city growth. In the developing countries, we have the big problem of marginal informal settlements and the gentrification that's happening at the same time in the inner cities. And it's happening here too, right? I want to put the nexus together with poverty, migration, urban, what I call social spatial exclusion. So the space is also part of the exclusion in the sense of where people live is determined also by their income levels. And that in itself is a social exclusion as well. And there's a nexus on that. Particularly, I'm referring mostly to Latin American cities, but also African cities and Asian cities. The political city, what I call, something is happening in the world. The political city is awake. So many people are living there now. A lot of urban movements and politics and protests and mobs and everything you want to talk about is in the city. And I'm following a little bit the Brazil elections that they just had the runoff, and a lot of stuff is happening in the city there too. Then we want to talk about a little bit about the municipal governance of the city, because a lot of people forget that as being like a very boring part. But without the governance of the city and the revenues to support it, we don't have the services, particularly the public services that people need. Climate change we have to talk about because cities are being challenged. We have sustainability of cities and environmental issues. I won't get into detail of all of this, but just like skimming things. And then of course the issue today, we talked about health as a human right, right? Education is a human right as well, enshrined in the UN Charter. So what is the access to that? What is the equity of it, the quality and the effectiveness of these urban services? Like how do we see results and outcomes different in different places that people live? And I'm very much interested in greening the city. I'm working on something right now, new approaches and lessons learned. And then I have something for you, like a game simulation exercise, but we'll do it later because I have to be restrained in my enthusiasm to do too many things. So bear with me here. So let's start with it. I'm going to make these little statements, and then we're going to go into the box like a Russian doll. We're going to open it up a little bit and peek inside and see what I mean. So the first statement is, throughout the world, cities are growing relentlessly. We know this, becoming a more urbanized population. In Latin America, 68% already people live in cities, right? Propelled by what? Globalization, market forces, the change in economic base of cities, because action is not so much happening in factories, but more in services, poverty, the rural-urban divide, particularly in our developing countries, demographics, migration and refugee streams. Refugees are ending up in cities and adding on to this already problems of managing the city services, right? So Africa, just quickly, I'm not an Africa specialist, but I use a lot of work on Africa in my globalization class. So we have right now in Africa, of 320 million people, 37% live in cities. But it's growing so fast. By 2030, we'll have 50% living in cities. Water and sanitation. This has all political ramifications too, and as we'll see later in the presentation. So in Africa right now, 40% of houses and yards are connected to either individual or communal standpipe for water, and not even 20% to sewer. So we have a big problem there and a gap. Last 10 years, 83 million urban Africans, yes, access to water, 42 million better sanitation, but the gaps are huge because the population keeps growing and also the migration into the city keeps expanding. So you just cannot keep up.
Can I ask what a standpipe is?
Yeah, it's just a pipe in a yard where people can go and collect water. And most of the times it's broken or it's not working or the water is not necessarily clean, but it's sometimes the only source of water for urban households.
So that's
communal standpipe.
Yeah, so city water and you just with a little tap.
Yeah, but if the tap is broken, there's no water. Or sometimes there's shortages, so that the city would just have that standpipe running 2 hours a day or so.
And you carry that into your house.
You carry it into your house, right? Because you don't have the meter piped thing. We'll talk about that. That's an equity issue too. So I looked at the growth of African cities. It's amazing. 17 of the 31 big cities have a growth of 3.7% a year, and 5.3% in these cities, which is Abuja, Nigeria, which is the capital, Kumasi, Ghana, Luanda, Ouagadougou, Burkina Faso, and Cameroon. So in 10 years, we will have this population doubling. This is an exponential thing that is going to be very difficult to manage, right? So what is happening? What are the impacts? Of course, we have more pressure on urban infrastructure and financial pressures on local government to provide the services, and they are not able. Demand is outpacing supply, so the systems are carrying more as planned and they're breaking down, and they don't have enough funds for maintaining the systems. So most of the standpipes would be broken. It would be very difficult to find working things. And in many of the developing countries, and at least those that I've visited and worked on and researched, there's not a culture of maintenance. So the assets deteriorate very quickly. There's not enough money to even build things, let alone maintain them. People don't understand and appreciate the value of maintaining things. The job creation, we have it, a problem with more people into the city. You're going to have more informal sector activities, hustling, big thing right now, finding a job wherever, selling whatever you can sell, whether it's dubious or not, and shadowy areas of work. When I did my PhD, it was on the informal sector in Latin America. This is many moons ago. And I still go back to look at it, and it's still the same way, right? Because the urban economy cannot provide these so-called formal jobs. And I'll talk about it later. There's a skills mismatch, too, in what the education system is bringing out. So we got the housing gaps plus the high market prices because of the land markets leading to the squatting system. So people have no choice but to make their own houses and make their own jobs. And that is agency. I call it agency. I don't see it as a bad thing. If you don't have a job, you will find a job. And if you don't have a home, you'll make a home, right? My other little blurb there, which I will open up later, is, so we have in the cities, we can see different patterns, economic patterns, social patterns, and spatial patterns, how people live, where they live, how the space is distributed. And this is a mirror of the society as well. So in the society, you also have those patterns. This is a mirror image of poverty, social exclusion, or inclusion, fragmentation, and inequity. What are these inequities? These are just a few. I mean, I looked at this in many ways, but just let's say the research shows that in poor areas, the police presence is less. And this is it. This is all over in Latin America. In particular, I've looked at that. So that's why you have, say, in Rio or in Colombia, or you've probably heard about the Narcos movie and Escobar and all of this. This is just like Hollywood, but what it shows is that the crime incidence is higher, but the gangs are managing those areas. They're policing the areas. Because police presence is not there. I was in Kingston, Jamaica, doing a project this summer, a consulting project, again, looking at urban crime and dropout rates of youth and trying to help the Jamaican government. And there are 175,000 young people who have no jobs when they're coming out of high school. But yet I went to see the police. I went to talk to the probation officers and the court system and the jails. And in front of the police station, some of them, I saw tanks, like military tanks. Like, why do you need it? Because we can't get out of here. Because it's so hard for them to police an area that has a lot of drug activity. So you can see it even in the way that the police are behaving, right? The other thing about it is landfill. This is also true in the U.S. Landfills, incinerators, dump sites, radioactive dump sites, and polluting industries are generally, not necessarily always, located in the poor areas. I saw a study from the AAG, American Association of Geographers, in which they showed where polluting sites in this country are and how close they are to African American communities and Native American communities. That's where you dump stuff. And so you also have disease differentials. In Brazil, people who live in very poor favelas have a higher impact of disease vectors, and they have higher mortality rates and infant mortality rates. So also the poor live in areas where they're in polluted areas, so they have more vulnerability to pollution, air and water, and to storms, because when you have an earthquake, think about Haiti when they had an earthquake, a lot of those people who were living in fragile housing immediately crumbled, right? And if you live in like the favelas in Rio, you're going to get swept in mudslides and so on. Again, I looked at transportation and public infrastructure, again related to income. Where you live is also related to income, but how can you afford to get into the city? Most poor people who live in squatter peripheries take 2.5 hours sometimes to get to work, to their informal places, and what is the marketplace. And this was the same when I was a student and doing my PhD, and hasn't changed much. So social status and location is also a function of ability to access your job, your workplace. And if it's the informal sector, it'll be in the urban informal economy. There are examples to integrate poorer areas. This is Medellin, Colombia. They're using the cable cars, a brilliant idea by a very forward-looking mayor, to use the cable cars to access the people who live at the top, who are the poorest people, so that they can get into the city easier. It's working very well, even though it's very expensive, relatively speaking, but this is an example. Here's another of my little statements. In most urban areas in developing countries, the formal and the informal coexist separately, but intersect a lot. So I'll explain what I mean. So I call it a dualistic economy in the urban spaces. So what do you have? You have on the one hand, insecure land tenure of the informal self-built housing. Because they don't have land tenure, they take over and just make their own place, and they don't have, they wait, eventually they get the electrical and the water, but it takes a while. This is coexisting with the formal and urban land markets that are mostly speculative and property titles. So when you buy a house in a higher income neighborhood, you expect a property title. For the others, it's a fight, and it's a political struggle to get your title eventually. The second divide I find, the dualistic economy, is between the informal sector, people who are not paying taxes and are just hustling and are not in the tax net and are not getting any benefits, as opposed to the salaried people, usually in the public sector, in the government or corporate employment. But yet you have linkages of the two, because you would find, like in urban cities, you would find like the real shops would hire people, vendors, to sell their products outside of the shops. So they're selling on a commission basis. So you have a lot of linkages. And you have a lot of linkages in the, what I call the entrepreneurship trade. So people who are selling like smuggled cigarettes, like in Paraguay, will be selling to the regular people who are working in a business or coming out of the government employment, right? So you have a lot of connections. So the urban economy is also a connector of the formal and the shadowy activities. I'm working a lot on this. I'm actually working on a book on the new or different contemporary slavery modalities, as opposed to the previous chattel slavery, how people work with human trafficking and smuggling people. But the money laundering is the real thing, because money laundering, if you go to Panama City and you look around, you see all these beautiful buildings. They're all wonderful, very modern and expensive. But in the night, the lights are not on. There's nobody living there. It's laundered money coming from the Colombian cartels, buying up real estate, washing it so much that it's just like a building. And then they eventually will sell it, right? So that's how it works. And it works also through banks. And even trade, and even the regular store you would go in to buy a washing machine, you might wonder, like, who's behind it? So the other point, the fourth point, is rural poverty is also a factor that is fueling the city growth, adding the squatters. But at the same time, while the peripheries are growing, the inner cities are becoming gentrified and being resold to higher income inhabitants. And the tenements are being cleaned up and the people are being evicted. This is a classic is Brazil, and I looked at it in Panama recently, and I have a picture to show you later. The other problem is the informality, the food problem. Cities are growing. You would imagine they would stimulate the rural economy to provide that food. Not always, because the city people are buying cheap processed food more and more, and that's cheaper than have to buy from the rural areas. And also the rural areas, the food they're producing require a lot of cooking and processing. Just think of African cities. People don't have time for that anymore. So the rural areas are not really reaping the benefits of the city market. And the urban dietary changes, people are just going to buy McDonald's or whatever.
Are some of the cities also growing so large that they're actually taking up the rural area of like what used to be farmland?
Some of them, yes, some of them. But most of the time, the periphery, the squatter settlements are not settling on private agricultural land. They're settling on barren, arid, abandoned land or slopes where there's no agriculture. But that happens too. Also, people who have land outside the city that were formerly from farming families are just selling it to developers and saying, develop it in the land market, and they're coming out of agriculture. You have a lot of things happening at the same time. What is happening too in a lot of developing world cities is that you're going to find, like if you go to Tegucigalpa in Honduras, right? You cannot sometimes even see the houses. They're behind the walls. I worked a lot on urban projects in Latin America. So you have the gated compounds, the private security, the social clubs, and the, what I call the sterile malls, all geared for this type of higher income consumption, but the rest of the city is living. They're in the markets, the bazaars, the hustle and bustle is going on, the trading is there, the bartering is out there, the art on the street, the handicrafts. So you have like a dual cultural life happening. And why a lot of this is happening is because the upper classes or the middle classes are afraid of crime. And so one of the reasons they're retreating is because their perception of crime is that if I saw it in Jamaica, if I don't retreat, I'm going to be, mugged, or people are going to invade my house. And that's what's happening, that you see two lives going on, two different lives. In Brazil, the latest thing in urban development is to build these neighborhoods for upper class people where they don't even have to go anywhere. They have their shopping there, they have their cinemas there, they have their parks there, they can walk. They just go in and just go to work and come back. There's nothing else to be done outside in real life, in the real city. So this is an example of Panama City that I'm working on a little bit. So the ones that you can see here is what is happening right now. They're all blocked up, closed up, because they're going to become the next one, this. Right? This is all beautiful colonial type buildings that were, you can still see people living here. You see the washing there on the line. People, they will be evicted or paid off or bribed or whatever to leave. This has been a relentless process that I'm kind of documenting there. Now we come to the city management. Like here you have like a city executive, we call it the county executive we have, or the city manager. We don't have these ideas. Cities don't have the planning, policy, and regulatory frameworks. And the city management is not looked at as something that is a professional job. It's a mayor and a city council, but they're politicians mostly. So you don't have this professional look at what's the expertise to manage the city, where are the human resources I need, how about the revenues, the taxes, the property taxes. It's just incipient planning. There are some exceptions, of course, but it's generally still in the way of the city is just like managing itself. This lack of planning is going to be a problem in the sense that when we have the climate change and the other challenges hitting the bigger cities, particularly coastal cities, they will not be prepared to deal with it, and they're already not prepared. So, sorry to push all this on you, but just quickly, what are the planning issues? I think it's the lack of cohesive and coordinated policy. So, if you're doing something in city transportation, you're not coordinating with the environmental people. And if you're doing something in energy in the city, you should be maybe coordinating with somebody else. It's the health and the education are just very disjointed and siloed. We have a very big problem of inadequate visioning. So one of the things I did over the summer with Panama was to do a foresighting exercise with them. What is Panama going to look like, and what is the city of Panama going to look like in the year 2045? And what are we doing now that is taking us there or not taking us there? That was kind of interesting because they're now realizing that they cannot manage longer term challenges, particularly the traffic management. So we have the problem on the third line, property taxes. When I look at the property taxes, I know it's a very boring thing for a lot of people. And I see that in Guatemala, mansions and totally upper class neighborhoods have not had property tax assessments or increases for the last 20 years. How is the city going to manage if it does not take in revenue, right? So why is this so? Because people who sit in the city council are going to block a lot of your tax increases. It's a political issue. Only in Guatemala, only 12% of people pay income tax. How can you manage if you don't have regular income tax revenues?
Who are those 12%?
These are usually the ones that work in the government, where you can take out their withholding, like how Georgetown withholds for us. Everybody else is not paying. The informal sector is not paying. They're not in the tax net. And the rich people are definitely not paying. They're running losses. So you have a very narrow tax base. And any attempt to try to move that is going to be very difficult. And for that reason, the cities are starved. Yes?
Friends of mine overseas in Africa have had a problem of moving to other places to live. And one of the reasons why I see they have a problem is that landlords require 1 year or 2 years of rent in advance. Is there any movement away from the annualization of rent so that people can pay on a monthly basis or even a weekly basis their rent?
Your friends are foreigners in Africa?
No,
They're
citizens.
Citizens of Africa.
Is that in this country?
No.
In
We're talking about West Africa, West Africa where...
It happens a lot because landlords want to get that money and float it and use it. And there's no law against it. When I was living in Panama, I had to pay a year in advance. I'm not a Panamanian.
Yeah, and that's probably one of the biggest reasons why people can't find any formal housing. And when they do come to the town and whatnot and face the reality of God knows how much they have to pay, that they have to settle for
the informal. Yeah. In Kenya right now, in Nairobi, there's this thing called backyarding. What happens is that people, if they have a little space in their backyard, so they're already living there in the city, they take this backyard and they make a little shack and a shelter or a little house without water, and they rent it to people. So that's called, it actually has a name now, backyarding, so that they can get some income. And all they do is have this standpipe, be used for the water, and toilet facilities. I don't know what happens there, but people are always willing to rent them.
Backyard B&B?
Yeah, it's like an Airbnb thing in that sense. So you're right. So we have the problem of zoning in the city. I look a lot at city zoning laws. You can bribe your way in many cities into building on top of a water aquifer if you have the money. Because even though you do have zoning plans, Mexico City has a lot of regulations on earthquake-proof building. Bribery and corruption is there. So zoning is not necessarily a practice, it's a theory sometimes, right? Because you don't have the enforcement of the zoning restrictions. If you have water aquifers, you're not supposed to build on them. Who cares? People just pay money. Developers are always very good at undermining these things in some areas. And you have a weak human resource base in the government offices who can really do the work of vetting these permits. So that's another problem. It may be that they would want to enforce it, but they don't have the skills base to enforce it. So the rule of law, because I said before, we don't look at the city as a CEO function, right? And the rule of law, this is why the cartels run amok in the city, because they are the ones that can put some law and order in some places. They have the guns, and they have the power, and they're bribing a lot of other people. The other problem I find is the limited client orientation and service delivery. So the city, the public sector, is trying its best to provide all of these services, public services, the ambulance, the fire. You're lucky if you get an ambulance coming in some places in 30 minutes. The problem is that they don't see it as a client orientation service. So there's not this client feedback and this effectiveness. How can I improve the efficiency? That's not yet. In some cities you have it, and like in Santiago, Chile, you have that, and in other cities you don't. And it's very incipient to think about, I am serving the interests of the citizens and they're my clients, that kind of thinking. The e-governance is starting in Mexico. You can go online and you can do your driver's permit and all these other things. Most countries are dealing and trying to do it. The mobile telephone is a big help, the new technology. The consensus on public programs. Here you would have like a city hall or a city meeting, a town hall to figure out we're building a new like where I'm living, the library was closed. They were going to build some housing, so there was a public like meeting. What do the citizens think? And of course I went to find out what they're going to do. They don't have this kind of consensus building. It's difficult. And the media influence is also very, very, very powerful. Tracking what's happening in the Brazil elections, the manipulation is so horrible. I mean, if you read everything, if you listen, well, we have this runoff candidate, Bolsonaro, that just is the top one from the military, formerly of the military. He is running on a racist platform. For example, in a country like Brazil, he's saying black Brazilians are uneducated. He says, I wouldn't rape a woman if she wasn't pretty enough. I mean, those are the things that are part of his platform. People are buying it because they're manipulated. They're buying it. Sounds familiar, right? But this is really crazy. This is really crazy. And I don't need to tell you who is the one of his campaign advisors. It's Steve Bannon.
Oh no.
Oh my gosh.
I'm really worried about this Brazil thing because the platform is so xenophobic. Oh, when he talks about homosexuals and women, it's just impossible. Brazil is a very open, diverse society. What is happening to them? I worked for like 10 years in Brazil when I was a development banker, and I'm so horrified what's happening. And people are buying this thing anyway. I don't know. It makes you want to cry. Okay, now this is why I'm coming to that. Cities around the world are becoming hotbeds of organized crime. This is not for every city, but what's happening, it's driving the Bolsonaro votes, right? Political activism, and the pendulum shift is going from right to left and back. Why? Because people have severe security fears of crime. So when he stands up and says, I am the strong man, and he is from the military, I'm gonna set this right. The political change and the voting patterns occur. Simple. It's just a question of people are worried. They follow. But the cities can also be something that is positive, right? Not to dwell only in the negative. So we have in the city greater access to information, communications, and social media. The possibility of advocacy, the possibility of citizen engagement, which is probably less common in the rural areas because they don't have the scale of people living together. And of course the organized protest, because remember the Arab Spring was using social media, right, to connect up.
It was very urban driven.
Very urban driven. Everything now is urban driven. So the city is a center of political activism, and it could be for good or bad. It could be for violence or it could be for change. But there's a barometer, and I call it a springboard for change. Innovation, culture, and entrepreneurship. All ideas happen in the city. I mean, that's where things are maturing. That's where people are reading, listening to things. That's where people get more educated if you come from rural areas. So you have an opportunity for mobility, social change through education, some health services, and you have agency for former marginalized and discriminated groups. If you follow the news, in Argentina recently there were these women out there voting, protesting for pro-choice, right? All happened in the city. It's a hub for a fight against corruption in many cities in the world. To protest water and utility rates increases, that's where they go out and they bang pots and pans and women's rights and political unrest. To close this section up, many cities are struggling financially and institutionally to cope with everything, the demographic. I wouldn't want to be a city mayor really in many of these cities. I don't know how it would start. And I'm trained enough to look at these issues, and still I would have a headache every day. You have the demographic problems, you have the labor market, the migration, you have refugees coming in, you have the growing demand for public services, the crime or fear of crime, you have the corrupt law enforcement services to deal with. And therefore, people are saying, we need a strong man to deal with this. Not a CEO, not a trained person. We need a strong man, preferably from the military, to put all these things in order and lock up these criminals and probably not, like a Duterte, not even give them due process. This is why you're getting all these different things.
That's the Philippines.
That's the Philippines. But it's happening, Bolsonaro is a strong man too. People are saying he's the only one that can combat crime. Forget what he's saying about human rights.
Are they shooting people in the streets?
Not yet. No.
But they still have machine guns to the...
They got it, they're ready.
They're ready.
The roads leading to the favela.
Brazil has had a military dictatorship for many, many years.
What do you think, if you were the city manager, what would be the highest leverage item that would make the most sense to put all your efforts toward?
I would have to say education. I think that it begins with education. And because in Latin America, which I know very well, the dual system of education is so different. If you are poor, you have no chance for good education. It's a dualistic system. If you have some money, you will never send your child to a public school, unfortunately. Because you will know that that's like not a ladder for mobility. So people who don't have money do go to the public schools, overcrowded. I mean, I worked a lot on education projects. It's such a thing, it's such a challenge. I would put my money in education and my efforts. Yes?
What about those socioeconomic moves that were taking place during the Lula administration?
Yes.
For example, you know, if you send your child to school,
You get the stipend, the Bolsa Familia.
for the shots and things like that.
Yeah.
Did they have an impact?
They did. I've seen evaluations of those. They have an impact. The impact they have had is on bringing more people into the classrooms, because now the parents are motivated for the attendance,
Yes.
but it has decreased the quality because you have more overcrowding.
Yes.
Now more kids are coming to school, but the teachers are still the same to teach them. A. B, when the budget is reduced, the Bolsa Familia is unsustainable. You cannot manage education, since we're all educators, through the patchwork. You have to do policy change. You have to do budgetary changes from the top. This is very quick. If you look at the budget of the education industry in any one of these countries that I've worked in, you will see that the highest amount of money is going to the university sector. And the least amount is going to the primary, the pre-kinder, the areas that you needed more, primary education and preschool education. So obviously, and Brazil is like this, by the time you get up to take this exam, to get to a public university, which is very good, you cannot pass the exam. It's only the private school students are passing the exam, and the public universities are heavily subsidized.
Which brings up a question.
It's equity.
Yeah, what about the idea of diversifying the universities?
Well, Lula tried it. He did the affirmative action to try to get more Afro-Brazilians into the universities, which is a dire shame. He did do that. I don't know that this new government is going to be very interested. Calling Afro-Brazilians uneducated, illiterate does not give me much confidence. I don't know that they're going to work with that anymore. I've been to many universities in Brazil and even given talks like this. And it's all white Brazilians, all white Brazilian students, very few Afro-Brazilians. And indigenous Brazilians you wouldn't find there. It's such a shame. So instead of going into more progressive thinking and progressive use of taxes, we're going to be going into a different direction. But let's continue. So what are the pressure points? I'm saying here, city elites, whether those that sit in the municipal government or those that have a say, they lack the interest and the means to provide either affordable housing or creative means to finance services for the poor. The developers and the speculators and architects are coming from the main universities. They're more attracted to investments in high-income housing and lucrative housing. So you have to have a new breed of architects in Brazil or in any of these countries that are saying, I want to come up with a creative way to have housing solutions for the poor that includes water, includes sanitation, a dignified way of life, right? That is not happening, though some universities are coming up with nice and simple ways of providing housing that's not like, you know, too expensive. Again, the municipal revenue, we don't have it for public housing and public works. And then we have the job problem, that the private investments into job creation are just not enough. And then the people coming out of schools don't have the skills for the new economy type jobs. The computer-based, the skills, because you cannot get a good technical education, as you know, if you don't have the bottom, the foundation of math, English, or Portuguese, or whatever it is. So it's very hard to and this is the problem I was looking at in Jamaica with the Jamaican government, how to do boot camps for these young, 175,000 young men and women who have no jobs. Can we do boot camps for them? Can we do the Khan Academy? Do we have to put them in school and they drop out anyhow to sell ganja on the street? Can we do something else? So we're looking at changing things, changing perceptions, and creative cutting across your regular things that you've done. The school systems have so much inertia, right?
You mean an academic boot camp?
Yes, academic and a coding boot camp to bring up the computer skills, right? You have to start with the bottom, some math, some basic things, but then, like, you know, put them in a different track, and not that involves sitting in a school and dropping out, because that's what's happening. And the way of teaching is so boring, and you know, they're just not. It just doesn't apply to them.
Who's filling the jobs if the people?
They're bringing people from outside.
That's okay.
If you look at the Glassdoor, you probably know that's a website that I looked at Glassdoor for Panama. So many jobs are on there for Panama. What's wrong with the Panamanians? Why can't they do it, right? So they're bringing in people, or the people who are educated coming out of the universities who are wealthy already. They're the ones getting the jobs. The inequity persists from the education to the job market. And then the crime, we talked about that and how that's changing. So what's happening though, we have the shifts in the economic base. I studied urban economics, so I'm always looking at what's the base of the city? How does the city live? What is driving the city base, right? The economics of it. So we have a different switching to startups and e-commerce in many cities, and the rise of the telephone, the cell phone is very important. We still have the poor quality of public education and training versus the private, leading all along up to the poor labor skills and the lack of competitiveness of children and adults from poor families. We have the developers in charge of the city with the tax incentives. So there's a big problem of land speculation. There's an emphasis on city planning, on highways and car ownership, and the urban sprawl, and then you have the land speculative behaviors on gentrification. And what's happening in globalized export-oriented economy, ports and coastal cities are way ahead of cities that are inland, right? So they're getting a little bit the greater impetus on growth. And then we have the climate change on top of it, rising temperatures and sea levels, storms, flooding, and so on, and the impacts of coastal erosion. So this is what we can expect, the coastal flooding and sea and port defense. Even those cities that are moving ahead have this problem to deal with. It's going to take them more money, and again, as I said, the revenues are not enough, to adapt and to move populations out of the way. We have a severe problem with water, potable water for the city, because we have two things happening. Saltwater intrusion through the rising sea levels already, and the overuse of the aquifers in the city itself. Like Mexico City is sinking because it has used up all its water, and this is causing the whole city to sink. And we have the issue of drought, because everything, the climate is not balanced. Glacial melt, low river flows. All the cities on the Peru, Chile coast have no water because it's desert, basically. Think about it. The water is coming from the highlands, the rivers in the highlands, and the glacial melt is already creating flooding, and also drought is creating no water supply. We have pollution to deal with, and we have the conflicts of land. So water shortages overall, I think, in global cities. 1 billion people in the world currently, no access to safe drinking water. And 2 billion, no access to sanitation. Mega cities, I talked about the problem. of accessing water. They have to access water from further distant sources, and it's more expensive. The price of water is rising. This is a statistic on the US, but it's everywhere. And if you have squatter settlements on high slopes, on steep slopes, it's technically and very difficult and costly to run the pipes uphill and to get them the water supply. And then you have the constant fear of landslides because they're perilously positioned on these slopes. Lack of clean water has health issues. We talked about health today, right? Affects hand washing, domestic cleaning. It's also affecting even washing of hands for religious rituals if you don't have water to wash, to do the ritual washing that you need. Hygienic food preparation and the spread of diseases. Water is a problem. And the standpipes is irregular. Some people have to buy water from vendors, from the trucks. This is heavily polluted, expensive water. In fact, one study shows the people in slum settlements pay more for water than the people in high-income settlements who get their water piped in from the municipal service. This is the irony of it as well, right? Because it's a monopoly of these vendors selling them the water to private trucks. And whereas the rich areas access water, pay less for residential waters and sewage. Garbage pickup they have. Solid waste is a major problem in slum areas. Piped water is there, and landscaping, and even swimming pools and golf courses, they all have water. In Asia, this is a big problem in rivers, and particularly in China. Rivers have, in cities, have 4 times the world average of suspended pollutant solids, 20 times those of high-income countries, 3 times the world's average for bacteria from human waste, and 50 times the World Health Organization guidelines. I looked at this problem in Brazil. In 2015, we had the worst drought since 1930 in Sao Paulo. It's a city of 20 million people in the metropolitan area. So water had to be rationed. You know what the mayor told the people? Get out of the city, there'll be no water. Find a place to go and live with someone else until we get water. This led to the highest level of street protests in Sao Paulo and riots for water, right? You see the politics, how it is an impact. Mexico City, I talked about it. It's sinking. It's extracting twice as fast as it can replenish. 36% of the water is lost to leaks. With the pipe breaking, because as the city sinks, the pipes are breaking as well, causing the water to mix with the sewage. What is Mexico's response? To bringing water from distant highland communities that are poor for the city population, because the city, they're scared of the city politics. More people are there to protest, and these people that are far away, they're losing their water to the Mexico City. So now we come to what to do quickly, how to green, how to change the cities. So I talk about the Paris Accord pledges, the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals on sustainable cities. That's one of the goals. And you should see what those goals are. The greening of cities, the changes in the urban economy, the use of the LEED building standards, that's happening a little bit more. Energy shifts to cut out the cars and the private cars and move to bus lines and green buses, and the bike sharing and the sustainable transportation, the cable cars and so on. Bogota is starting. Copenhagen is the world's model on biking. Police are biking. Your mail is delivered on a bike. There's 40% of all Copenhagen workers are using bikes to go to work, right? And then you have Singapore, which is doing great on recycling water for the city and using gray water even to such a point where you drink it, right? From sewage to glass, right? They use wastewater for everything. Gardening, swimming pools, industry, and drinking. Green infrastructure, so managing storm water runoff, bioretention cells or rain gardens, and avoiding the urban sprawl and highways by going back to compact transportation and pedestrian and bicycle friendly. Because the city, when it developed, it never put that in the planning. So now we have to go back and replan everything. And then, of course, all the recycling that you can think about. This is happening a lot in Peru, the green motor fleets, and in Bogota. They're using hybrid and electric buses in Quito. Quito has now electric buses, right? Reduced water consumption is the name of the game, how to make water use more efficient and save water and recycle water. The LEED building standards, well, they come from the US, right? US Green Building Consortium. But people are now learning about it, and Singapore is really working well on that. I just put out here the benefits. You save water, you save energy, you save, you reduce your wastewater production and you reuse it, and you save your construction waste, right? And then there are all the tax credits for green industry and green building and green water. So these are some resources. I'm not plugging my book. I'm not saying you should buy it, but you could probably get it in the library. And I think some schools might have it now in the library because it's been selling well in the school areas and in the libraries. I don't make any money off of this either. It's a public good, really. And the other one, if you want to look at the whole complex of conflicts, which is beyond the city, but part of the city, I recommend this other book, Natural Resource Conflicts. I've written one article in this one too. And it's about everything, the world. So your global studies is in here, right? You have Africa, the Middle East, Asia, and the Pacific, the Americas, Europe, and then the concepts. And then the final book, which I like and I use in my Georgetown class, Environmental Problems in an Urbanizing World. I think that's that. So we're going to stop here, and then we'll do something later.
Perfect. So questions? Lunch?
I know it went very fast, but I feel like I needed to breathe or something.
At the pace of cities, right?
Any questions, comments, complaints? Go ahead.
Yeah, so all of the things that you suggested were, you know, reiterating the situation were rational things. But there, to me, it seems like sort of stepping back from what you're talking about, there's kind of a, I don't know, maybe I'm making it too abstract, but sort of a paradigm of irrationality in the sense that, you know, societies are not planning for themselves. They're not looking towards the future. Like you said, you went to Panama and they, you know, try to do the 2045, look ahead and so on. Yeah. And it seems to me that, you know, it's more a paradigm of, you know, everyone for yourself. And it seems like the ones who are successful, the rich people, I mean, and maybe this is too simplistic, you know, like it that way. They're getting ahead. And so, you know, they're fine with the way things are. And there's no commitment to saying, okay, well, as a society, as a whole, we would, if we took care of ourselves, all of us took care of each other, we would get farther ahead. But that denies them their special place, clawing to the top and being the top dog in whatever they're doing. And they see that, I think, as a threat to their status and their success. And so there is this sort of consensus, and they control the politics.
Yeah, well, that's all
true.
So
it's just locked into, we won't go anywhere. We can't use rational solutions because we like it the way it is.
That's true, but also even they are understanding that there's a sustainability problem here. Mm-hmm. So in their own self-interest, they're seeing that they will not, like for example in Jamaica, I met with the top investors and the top private sector enterprises as well to find out, what are you doing, what are you thinking, how can you contribute to this debate, don't you need qualified, skilled people to work? And they said, yes, we lament the fact that we don't have these people. How can you be a part of this solution? And I think that there is a breakthrough in some places where they're saying, I don't want to always be advertising and bringing in people and work permits, and I want to have my people right there. And the hotel's very receptive to, whether it's in self-interest or whether it's really thinking ahead and thinking, well, I'm affected too if I don't have the qualified people. Whatever the motive is, I've seen a lot, a change in the tone and the thinking and the collective thinking. Still, politics is running everything, but we have a lot of change makers and pace setters coming up in the younger, dynamic population, people who have graduated from college, people who are coming back from the diaspora. And I met with a lot of people from the diaspora back into their countries doing startups and bringing an energy that I think will perhaps not necessarily change everything, but definitely put a new spark into it. And I felt when I came back, like, wow, I mean, it's much more than I thought there was.
Well, I hope you're right, but
yeah.
I mean, I just see that kind of...
The old patterns will persist, but there's always going to be a new change maker.
I just want to sort of add to that comment a little bit by saying that I think we need to start holding conservatives' feet to the fire, because unless they're conserving things instead of just breaking them or letting them break, they don't deserve the name. Maybe they're just reactionaries. So there's sort of a widespread thing in the media to make this dichotomy, the binary liberal-conservative, so then conserve stuff.
Yeah.
Bringing it back to the K-12 space and making connections for our younger audiences. So much of what you mentioned, the dual cultural lives happening, you know, in a lot of places with literal walls, but something that our students see happening in DC every single day. Because of gentrification, the inequities in public education. These are all things that our students experience very much personally and locally. But what we're trying to do in our courses, and also as a district, and thinking about embedding global context into everything we do, is how do we help students see that these are larger issues that are happening all around the world, and also they're happening right outside your door as well in a different way. So in specifically thinking about these dual cultural lives happening, because that's something very pressing that our students are seeing a lot more of in DC right now. What would be some case studies that you would recommend if we're thinking about trying to draw those connections from the local to the global? What are some strong, and if you want to think about it, get back to me or just recommend it at a later time, that's okay, but I'm trying to figure out, you know, what would be some strong, impactful ones that would also be accessible for younger audiences, that they could really get into and understand, and then draw the connections to their local experiences.
I think Brazil will come to mind.
All about global.
Yeah. Brazil is definitely a good case study. And I'm actually teaching a course here at Georgetown on sustainable cities in Latin America. I don't do the tour of the world in Latin America, but we have within the book we're using, and I can't remember the exact name of the book now because I'm blocking out. We have an article on this Brazil problem, and I could definitely let you have that. It's a little bit more for the university, but I think it has elements of what we've been talking about.
I just want to really, really quick say that if you ever need an article that's behind a gated wall in the university, let me know and we'll get the article out for you.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay?
A lot of it.
And you can translate it into high schoolese and whatnot, and middle schoolese.
Let's just go down the thing so we can.
I'm interested to know if any of your research has touched upon either historical and/or current impacts of popular urban movements. I have a very limited experience in Mexico City with the Colonias Populares, the organization. Yeah. So I just don't know what the current status of that is and what it is in other countries.
Lots of countries have these popular.
And what impact are
it does. It has an impact. The politicians, I think, stand up and take note in a city more than in a rural area. This is the space we're talking about because there are more potential voters. Since Latin America shrugged off its military dictators, because at one point we only had military dictators, right? Since we've become more democratic and people can vote, politicians are very aware. They're good animals to figure out where can I get votes. They're figuring out that if I have a problem and people are in the streets, I have to solve it, I have to address it. You know the problem of Cochabamba in Bolivia, where the actual street protests against the water rate increases led to a new election and a new president, who was the first indigenous Bolivian president in Bolivia, where you had a majority but never was elected. You only had white Bolivians being elected. That's the case in point that you have to see. Cochabamba it's in my book, I'm sorry to say that, I write about it in
No,
the book.
don't be sorry.
But that's one of the case studies I look at. That particularly because they killed a 16-year-old student from high school in that protest. And the outrage of it, the next day people just went to, because they'd been given a 35% hike in their water rate. And this is like too much. And then they killed someone, a kid. And that led to the demise of the current president at that time. He's living here in exile right now in DC. They took him in, I guess. And then the first indigenous president.
Just one thought about, is it her comment, her asking, well, so I was thinking of, I don't know if this makes sense, Silicon Valley favelas.
Yeah.
In other words, people who work in an area being priced out of that area.
Cannot live in the area.
And I'm sure it impacts this area too, but whether it's as
Right.
well known as it is, for instance, in the San Francisco area, I don't
Right.
know, but that could be one point.
You can bring
make
home
a strong
to-
connection between what goes
Exactly.
on, say, in
The tight housing market in this country. Anything else? I think.
Yeah, I was
Yes.
thinking, Zena kind of mentioned that with the gentrification and the whole piece. I remember the politics that went behind the Costco going to Montgomery
DC?
County.
Oh, to Montgomery, yeah.
Yes, and the constituents demanded that they not have the gasoline stalls because it would just boot everyone out of, you know, the small independent gas companies. So so it's right here. And
Okay, with regrets for the moment, but only for the moment, our lunch is ready and our next speaker is on a tight schedule.